Hello and welcome back to the Starter Series. For today's class, we're going to run through a handful of poses that are either seated, lying down, or all fours position. So with that, I do have a block for today's practice. I'm going to show you a pose that can be done with or without a block. At the end of class, I'm going to introduce the concept of using an eye covering. So if you have something like an eye covering, it could be a washcloth or something, grab that. And then I would suggest having either a cushion, a pillow, a blanket, a towel, something to bring so that you can sit up on. So have those handy for today's short class. And I'm going to start with a quote by Shunryu Suzuki. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So keep that in mind as we run through some of these poses. And as a student who is starting something new, or maybe that you've dabbled in it before, you're returning to it, or maybe you have practiced yoga for a while and you're just kind of wanting to go back and relearn the basics again, or whatever it may be. It can be daunting, especially if this is something brand new to you. If you're starting something, can be like, so keep in mind, the beginner's mind, there are lots of possibilities, but those who have been doing it for a long time, there are less. So it's a good thing to be starting something new and to be a beginner. So I'm going to show you what a lot of yoga classes start with. One of the, I want to call it a quintessential yoga pose that a lot of us start in is exactly how I'm seated right now. And this is called simple seat, simple cross-legged seat. So it's not so simple for everybody, depending on how your body is. So this is where a pillow, a blanket, a cushion, a towel would come in handy. I'm going to turn it aside so you can see this. So for a lot of us, it's nice to sit our seat up on something, because what this does is it raises the hips above the knees. And especially for some of us, if we sit flat, we're really rounded. This is very common to happen for a lot of people. So by sitting up on something, this helps to get rid of that rounding, and we want to get rid of that rounding. We want to have a nice, tall, straight spine in some of our poses. So this is easy seat is one of the terms for it. I usually refer to it as cross-legged seated position. From here, can do other poses, but this is a very nice base pose. So in this series, I'm obviously not going to run through every single yoga pose. There are lots of them. But I'm going to give you some of the base ones, and from these base ones, we do a lot of other things. We can do forward folds, we can do twists. There's a lot of things we can do with that. So if you are practicing with me, then go ahead and find your cushion or your pillow or your towel, and go ahead and sit up on it. Actually, let's just for an experiment, go ahead and try sitting without the cushion, the blanket, or the towel, and notice where you are there. And you may find that you don't need the tool, you don't need the pillow. So see where you are. And then also try sitting up on that and see how that feels. So just sit here for just a moment, close your eyes, and just feel what it feels like to arrive here. Now, when we do this, like right now, I've got my right shin in front of my left. You don't necessarily, I'm going to turn the other way so you can see that. So depending on what the teacher is telling you, sometimes we'll start with the right shin in front. Sometimes we'll switch it out and put the left shin in front. So for me, it's automatic for me to come in with my right shin in front. So that's just how I usually sit to start with, and then I'll switch out. But just sit here for a moment, and I want you to close your eyes in this pose and just get familiar with it. And this is lesson one with yoga is to listen to what your body is telling you. And just notice how you feel in this pose for just a moment before I introduce the next pose. Let's just take a moment. We're not going to rush through these. I'm going to give you a moment to be in it, feel what this is like, and to let this sink into your mind. Take a nice deep inhale through the nose. Exhale and let that go. All right, from here, go ahead and remove your pillow or whatever you were sitting on, if you were sitting on something. And from here, we're going to come into tabletop. Tabletop is a very common neutral pose that we will come into. And if you have any trouble with your wrist in this pose at all, I'm going to suggest using the blanket. I'll show you the pose without the blanket or the pillow. I'll show it to you without it. But I am one of those students who I do have wrist issues sometimes. So sometimes I need to elevate my wrist a bit because that'll help alleviate some of that pain. So I'll show you that in a moment. Now, obviously, if you have severe pain or if you have, any kind of, you've maybe just recently had surgery on your wrist or you've had any injuries on your wrist, then you would want to avoid being on your wrist. So you would have to modify your practice a bit until you're healed all the way up. But tabletop position is, in all fours, is pretty much what it sounds like. You're on all fours. So my wrists are underneath of my shoulders and my knees are underneath of my hips. And my spine, my back, is straight-ish as possible, as it can be, without dumping or rounding. So this is your neutral position. You could kind of think of it as if you had like a book balancing there. Would it stay there and not fall off? So if you find that this bothers your wrist, you could take a towel. I don't have a towel with me right now offhand, but I do have a pillow here. And you could simply elevate your wrist on that. So your wrists are elevated, but your fingertips are still on the mat. And that would alleviate some of that pressure you may be feeling. You could also do that with a rolled up blanket. You could also do that even with your mat rolled up. So you could take your mat and just do it in a little roll here. And the same idea. So your fingertips are on the ground or on the mat, and your wrists are slightly elevated. So that is our tabletop position. So if you're practicing with me, go ahead and come into that for a moment. And from here, we're actually going to do some movements from there. So we're going to do another very common pose that you'll see in a lot of yoga practices to help warm up. So let's just arrive here with that nice neutral spine. Everything's stacked. Wrists under shoulders, knees under hips. You can close your eyes for a moment and just feel what it feels like to be in this pose for just a moment before we come into a little movement and a great way to warm up the spine for a yoga practice. So from here, we're going to come into what are called cat and cows. And the first pose is actually going to be cow pose. And then the next one we're going to move into is cat pose. So if you've ever seen a cow, which I think most of us probably have, a lot of times they have kind of that little dip in their back. And if you've ever seen kind of a cat get up and stretch, you'll see them with their arched back. So that's what we're going to be basically doing with our spine. Great warm-up pose. So our cow pose is, we're going to drop the lower back area, and we're going to lift the chin up and look out in front of us, staying in our tabletop with our arms and legs. But now our tailbone is pointed more toward the ceiling, and our chin is toward the ceiling, and this is your cow pose. And your cat is simply the opposite. You're going to push the floor away, and then you're going to round your lower back, dome the upper back, and you're going to tuck the chin in. And this is cat pose. So if you've ever seen a cat stretch after a nap, and then you can come back to neutral, and you can go again. So typically in a yoga practice when we're warming up, we'll inhale and we'll do our cow pose. So we'll drop that lower back, lift the chin. You don't have to go super deep here. It can be smaller movements. And then when we exhale, we'll push the floor away and we'll come into our cat pose. And we'll run through those a few times at the beginning of a class, matching our breath with the movement. So inhales to cow, exhale to cat. So if you'd like to, go ahead and move through that for a couple of rounds, just to see what that feels like. Notice how it feels in your body. And this one is used a lot in the warm-up section of the yoga class, as I said. So it's a good one to get to know. And there's variations of this one, but this is the base pose. And then back to neutral spine with a nice flat back. And we can come off the wrist now for a minute and shake those out, give those a moment. So the next pose I'd like to introduce you to is child's pose. This is a great resting pose. So anytime you're doing a yoga class, especially if it's a flow class, that you're moving between poses and you need a rest, this pose I'm going to show you is just for that. You can take that at any time. You don't necessarily have to keep going. If you feel like I need a rest, then drop back into a child's pose. So I'm going to show you with a couple of props, because some people, this pose, for me, I love this pose, but some people it can be a little more challenging. So I'm going to just set my props out of the way for a moment. I want to start out with, first of all, child's pose can be done one of two ways. You can either have your knees together or near each other, or they can be more spread out and further apart. I personally love the spread out version of child's pose versus putting them together, but I'll show you both. So I'm going to start with my feet together, or my legs together here. And I'm sitting back on my heels right now. So this right here might be a challenge for some of you to sit back on your heels. And if that's the case, you can either take a pillow, a blanket, a towel, whatever, and sit up on that. Alternatively, you could use your block. If you have a block nearby or something like a block, you can sit that on your heels and between your seat, and that'll help prop you up. It's going to give you a little bit more lift, obviously, here. So that is an option. So I'm gonna do it without the prop just to show you, but you can always prop yourself up. And so if you have your knees together, this pose will look a little different. You're gonna come forward with your forehead toward the ground. Now your forehead may not reach the ground, and in that case, you could use a block. So you could bring a block out in front of you, bring your forehead to the block, and then your hands will now sweep behind you and they will reach back alongside your legs. So this is more of a kind of a closed child's pose. I typically do the other option of this, and I'll show you that in a moment. So if you were using both props, you could have this your pillow underneath of your seat, and you could have the block on whatever level you would like, whatever height, and you can come forward and bring your forehead to that block, and then your hands could go behind you. So this is one version of child's pose. This is very calming because it's when your forehead is either on the block or the floor, you're getting a little pressure there right between your eyes. So it's a very nice calming point on the body. So I will show you my favorite version of child's pose, which is the wide-legged. So you can have your knees out as wide as a mat if you like. They could be a little bit closer in, whatever feels best for you. Same options apply here. If your seat does not come down to your heels, perfectly okay. You can sit up on something, or if you don't have any props, you can just simply leave your seat up. So you have that as an option. And then you're gonna just fold forward, come on down, and you're gonna bring your hands out in front of you instead of on the sides. And forehead will come either to the block, a pillow or blanket, or to the floor. So here is child's pose. So now that I've showed you both, and I've showed you with the props, I'm going to do it without the prop this time just to show you. Go ahead and pick which one you want to try out, and go ahead and try it with me now and come into a child's pose. And this is what we consider a resting pose. So again, your seat might be further up, and that's okay. Over time, it will start to drop back. But stretching those arms out in front of you and just letting yourself go into the mat here. It's a nice stretch along the lower back. Just has a lot of great benefits. And it is also a common pose that we do in a lot of our yoga practices. So just arrive here for a couple of breaths. I highly recommend eyes closed in this pose. And then you can come all back up. And from that base pose, sometimes we'll have different variations we can do from that one too. So another great base pose to kind of put in your back pocket. From here, we're going to come on and lie on our back. So I'm going to leave the block over here to the side because I'm going to show you one variation with this that uses a block. There's an active version and there is a supported version. So we're going to lie on our back. And from here, you're going to have your feet on the ground. Knees are bent. Knees are pointed straight up. Shoulders are on the ground here. Hands are down next to your sides here. And this is called bridge. And this one is the unsupported version. So unsupported bridge. Get yourself comfortable there. And then you're going to lift your hips off the ground. And you're going to bring them up any amount. So sometimes you might stay a little lower. Other times, if you really want to get good stretch in, you might come up a little further and wiggle those shoulder blades, the arms, underneath of you a bit. Really pop the hips up a bit. So you can do a couple different things. You can stay lower or you can come up higher. This is an active pose. It is a great strengthener. It's a back bend, so it can be energizing. But the important point in this pose is to try not to have your knees splay way out or splay in, to try to keep them as straight up as possible. So this is the unsupported version. The supported version will utilize a block, and I'm going to put it on you can do either the lowest setting or the medium setting. I would not recommend the highest setting unless that feels okay for you. But for most of us, it's medium or low. And I'm going to go with medium on this one. So I'm just going to lift my hips back up for a brief moment and then slide that underneath. So I'll show you where this is going. The block when you're lying down is going to go right there about the small of your back. So it's actually at the sacrum if you know where your sacrum is. If you don't, that's okay. But it's right above where the buttocks curve out, and it's at the small of the back there. Not too high. We're not going way up here, but it's more like at the lower, below that, the small of the back. So that your back is actually hanging off of the block. So if you're in your supported version, come up there and set that. And you may need to play around with that a little bit. You just don't want it to be too high up. Like, I don't want this to be in the lower back region. I want it to be below that lower back. And then this is a supported version. So you're still getting the back bend effect, the front body opening, but you're not having to hold yourself up. So go ahead and choose whichever one you want to try out for today. And go ahead and come into that pose. Close your eyes. Take some breaths in and out through the nose. I haven't been cueing the breath as much into this one because I don't want to overload too much information, but breathing is also an important part of the class. But really, let's focus on getting into the pose, see how it feels, have the body awareness, see how that feels, and then add the breath as you're able to. So there's a lot going on, a lot to learn, but it's such a wonderful journey. So go ahead and close your eyes, see how this feels in your body. Adjust the block as necessary. You can lower it down. You can take it out entirely. Breathe in through your nose. Exhale through your nose or through your mouth. A lot of times we inhale and exhale through the nose in yoga, but you can also exhale through your mouth if needed. And then from there, go and remove the block and lower yourself all the way back down. If you weren't using the block, then lower yourself back down. And when we lower ourselves back down from that pose, we do it with control and slowly. So we almost one vertebra at a time, starting from the upper back and all the way down to the lower back, and the hips are the last ones to come down. Now from here, this pose is typically when we do toward the end of class. So the first few poses I showed you, those are more at the beginning. Child's pose can be used anywhere throughout the class, and these are more toward the end. So bridge is one toward the end, and then your supine twist is also toward the end. So supine simply means lying down. So we're going to hug our knees into our chest. So with your knees hugged into your chest, now we're going to simply take both of our knees stacked on top of each other the best they can and drop them over to the left. So they may not stack exactly, and that's fine. Just drop those over to the left, and you're going to take your right arm out to the right, and my left hand is just resting on top of those stacked legs. So this is your supine twist, and you're going to look over to the right, or if that bothers your neck, you can always look straight up. So go ahead and try this pose on for size. See how this feels. Close your eyes and take some inhales and exhales through the nose at your own pace. This is a great pose at the end of the class. It's one of my favorites at the end. It's a nice stretch along the spine here. It just feels good. So it's a nice way to finish out class. There's variations on this twist, but I'm going with a simple one today. This is usually called simple supine twist. It's the other thing you're going to find in yoga. There's lots of different names for things, so don't get caught up, don't get hung up on all of that. There's also Sanskrit names, so that can be overwhelming to some people, but you'll really find that over time, the names they'll just be ingrained in you because you'll hear them so much. So it's not about memorizing, it'll just come with time. Go ahead and bring your knees into your chest, and then we're going to go ahead and do it on the other side here. So go ahead and drop both your knees over to the right, and now my left arm is going to come out to the left, and my right hand will be resting on both of those legs here. And alternatively, and I didn't say it on the first side, but you could put either a pillow or a block or something in between to kind of help here. So your knees may not come all the way to the ground, or your left shoulder may not come all the way to the ground, and that's okay. That's common. So just play around with it and find what works for your body. These poses look different on all of us, so you don't get hung up on does it look exactly like the teachers or somebody else that maybe practiced yoga with you. We all look different in these poses, and that's okay. So some nice inhales and exhales through your nose there. Close your eyes for a moment and just rest in this pose. And then go and hug your knees into your chest. And then I'm going to introduce the last pose, what we call kind of the final resting pose in yoga. It's also called Shavasana. So I'm going to go ahead and call it by its Sanskrit name in that case because it is called that a lot in yoga. I don't use a lot of Sanskrit in my classes just to keep things easier and not to confuse people, but Shavasana or final resting pose is this is how we end most of our yoga classes. Now, a lot of people want to skip this pose, but this is a really important pose, even though it looks like nothing's happening. So I'm going to use a pillow because I like to have a little support underneath of my neck or my head. You don't have to have a pillow. And if you have an eye covering or something like an eye covering, grab that. And you're going to simply lie back on your mat, lie back on the pillow if you're using it. Get yourself comfortable here, flat back on the mat, and then you're going to have your legs stretched out on the mat. So now they are nice and spread out on the mat. There don't have to be a certain width here. This is just kind of let everything go. So you're going to let those flop open, and the same thing with your arms. You're going to come out to your sides, palms facing up, and just have those flop open. And then to really make this cush, you take that eye covering, your t-shirt, a washcloth, whatever it might be, and place those over your eyes to really seal in the effects of your practice with this final resting pose. Now, if for some reason this does not work for you to lie flat on your back like this and it bothers you, you can always come over to a side lying Shavasana. So you could lie on your side here, or you could even come over onto your stomach and rest your hands, or rest your head on your hands. So you have some options here if it doesn't work for you to lie on your back. But I'm going to go ahead and flip back over my back. Now this pose, obviously, it doesn't look like there's much going on. But this one, I would argue, is one of the most important, or one of the more important poses in yoga, because this is a pose that helps you integrate all the effects and everything from your practice into your body. So it is a final resting pose. It's kind of the transition from the class to back into off your mat, back into your day. So I recommend trying to at least do it 30 seconds to a minute at minimum of this at the end of your class. Try not to skip this one. Go ahead and try it on for size while we're doing this little intro series here, this little starter series. Go ahead and give yourself the gift to do this and try this out and see what it feels like. And for some, it can be difficult because you're restless, you're ready to move on, and this can be hard just to drop into this moment. So drop in, breathe in out through your nose, close your eyes, have your eye covered if you want, and just notice how you feel after this first little starter series class. Go ahead and stay there for a couple more breaths. And then to come out of this pose, and if you'd like to stay there longer because you're enjoying it, go ahead and stay there. But to come out of this pose, if you want to move on, otherwise ignore me, go ahead and stretch your legs out long and your arms out long. Give yourself a nice good stretch there. Hug your knees into your chest. Roll over to one side. And then use your hands to bring yourself back up. So we bring ourselves back up in a very careful and somewhat methodical way. So I hope this first class in the starter series was helpful. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope that this gets you excited for the next one and to continue learning more. Thank you for joining me. And until the next one.